Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Look, I do have editorial control afterwards. I'm willing to cut out all of your indiscretions. Anytime you start
it's a good time to mention I have severe
naming
Tourette's.
people in the industry, slinging shit at them.
Yeah.
So for everyone listening, I'm very pleased today to have on Matthew Gasda. He's a New York-based playwright, director, novelist, essayist, and probably a bunch of other things too. Every time I look into you, there's something new that pops up that you are doing or have done.
Theater director would maybe be the big one.
Yeah?
Yeah.
No, outside
of writing.
Outside of writing. I've just read The Sleepers, which is a novel you've written, which is to come out on the 6th of May, I think, with Arcade.
Yeah.
Really, really enjoyed it, and really looking forward to talking to you about it.
Yeah.
Before we start, very, very pro-shilling. Are there other projects of yours that you would like to shill? You can use a nicer word for it if you want.
No, shillings. I prefer we use the word shill. Not really. I mean, just my Substack, which I write probably 3 or 4 times a week. And then my theater company, the Brooklyn Center for Theater Research. Mm-hmm. If you're ever in New York, if there are ever Australians passing through, come check out Industrial Loft Chamber Theater, the highest order. But no, I have my regular projects and yeah, so that's all really people should know. I have some books coming out later in the year, a play collection. They can check out, I guess, my play collection, my extant play collection, which is Dime Square and Other Plays. But yeah, The Sleepers is the main thing that I'm trying to sell. Please buy copies. Or for listeners, I mean, maybe you're already interested. I mean, I'm guessing listeners are already indoctrinated into literary Substack, but it is crazy how few copies it does take to make a difference, especially for kind of smaller middle tier presses. Arcade is a middle tier press, size-wise, in terms of like number of sales, or even for Big Five. Big Five editors are desperate to get their own books above 1,000 copies. The whole industry is just kind of situated around clawing back 1,000 copies of sales, small or big. So yeah, buying novels is anyone buying a novel makes a meaningful impact on the lives of writers and editors.
Yeah, and you wouldn't
publicists.
believe the impact that these sort of podcasts can have. I mean, Matthew, you sent me your left little finger in exchange for coming onto this show, which I was initially thrown by, but I did appreciate the gesture.
Yeah, I'm gonna run out of digits by the end of the promotion process.
Yeah, once you get onto toes, either an author has really artistically matured or they're desperate. So, would you be able to introduce The Sleepers? So give people a sense of what this book is.
Yes, I just did an interview at noon today, so I guess I'm warmed up. It is a kind of tightly stage-managed look at a few intertwining affairs and relationships in New York, set between, really primarily set in the weeks leading up to the 2016 American presidential election, and then with a few chapters of aftermath set in the preceding years. And it's sort of ambiguous as to when those years are. You can sort of learn that later in the novel, 2 characters are walking out of the movie Marriage Story by Noah Baumbach, and that helps. Like, there are little hints at when. And you can sort of tell that the last chapter is post-COVID, but I've both voluntarily and under editorial discretion cut out some of the more specific, like, time markers. And you can also sort of vaguely trace the main protagonist, Anne's journey from, like, verso socialist blogger. He's a socialist blogger excited about Bernie at the beginning of the book, who has a deal with Verso to publish his next book, and is sort of a naive, like everyone was in 2015, is sort of a naive subject of his own ideology. And then by the time the book ends, you get the feeling that he is drifting towards what we would now call the post-left or even the right, in spirit more than in substance, because he himself has been the subject of social exile, which makes it seem like the novel is something. Like, I say all this to say like that, as you know, having read the book, Jack, that it's not really about all of that. It's really about the relation. I mean, the core of the book is really about these people's interpersonal lives and their betrayals and their kind of intentional self-blindness. But there's this, there's a framework, there's a social history that's hinted at that takes us from 2015 to 2021, 2020. And so it sort of loosely traces, I think, broader transformations in New York culture, American culture, between those years.
Yeah, I like you describing it as tightly stage managed, because if I were to describe it to someone, I would say it sits somewhere between a play and a novel from maybe the late 19th century.
Yes.
Sort of late 19th century realist novel
Yeah.
slash a play, because it is, it's completely realist, very, very interested in people's internal lives. There are fairly long descriptions of people's inner states, but that's combined with a very theatrical quality, and that certain lines read like stage directions. And some of the moments of humour in the book, like Dan suddenly doing stomach crunches or shadow boxing, come from those little asides, which is really very nice, very elegant. And
Thank you. People are like clicking. I'm clicking and unclicking the Amazon pre-order as they listen to this exchange.
Yeah. Its subject does seem it's three. There are three people who struck me as the most important, and then some other characters too, who aren't totally peripheral, because we do actually spend quite a bit of time in their heads.
Yeah, there's Akari, Mariko, and Dan are probably the three you're thinking of, and then Eliza and Xavier are like the two characters who the other, and then Suzanne are the three.
Suzanne.
And then there's only two other characters who even speak. There's kind of a frat bro, finance bro, who the college student hooks up with briefly, kisses at a party. There's very little, and her friends. There's
Yeah, and particularly these three central characters, although everyone to some extent is caught up in their own particular way.
Yeah.
And it feels quite aging millennial in some ways, or at least these three.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really hitting the realization that while they might have been told they were extremely special, they're having to grapple with the fact that to some extent they're all not completely mediocre, but they're not great people of history. They will have to do the things that their parents did that they might resent their parents for. They might find themselves slowly becoming their parents, and they are or aren't coming to terms with that. Before getting into the specifics, though, I did want to ask about how you started writing, because you've published quite a number of things, and from quite a while ago. How long have you been at it for?
Yeah, some very micro-press books, which I'm very proud of, but which almost nobody... Some people read. Now some people are going back and reading them because of later success, which I think was always kind of my understanding of my trajectory. Write the extremely for me things in obscurity, and then if you justify it with some more commercial success later, then...
Erotic Sonic fan fiction, first of all.
Totally just...
that.
Yeah. Exclusively.
Yeah.
So I've been at it for a long time. I moved to New York in the summer of 2011 with a very idealistic idea of the literary life and of being able to talk my way into some editorial godparents' good graces, and I just sort of had the idea that I would magically be made. And to some degree that isn't untrue, in the sense that outside of the time frame of total immediacy with which I approached my own career, at 22, maybe 23, I have stumbled and talked my way into into a theater career, into a publishing career, or a life as a writer. But it happened over 14 years, not one. And even then, it's hardly lucrative. I mean, it's hardly. I'm partially paying the bills now with writing, but partially at best. And it is true that only in New York, at least in the U.S., can you really meaningfully. And I'm not the only person with stories along the lines of like you talk to someone at a coffee shop, or in my case, I went up to a director after a play and convinced him to read the play that I'd written. You can find yourself in as a powerful person's personal assistant or get a book deal. I know, or I heard a story recently about someone who was a Harvard student, a sister of my friend who was writing her dissertation on Fanny Howe in Cambridge, Massachusetts. It's kind of an extension of the New York literary world anyway, and ended up talking to someone who's Fanny Howe's best friend and got invited to go meet Fanny Howe that day, and then ended up selling a book that's coming out, like a big 5-book. So there is that energy still, even as Instagrammable as New York has become, as much as it's like been done, like even as much as influencer culture has taken over, there are still these old school stories of finding your way. But yeah, so it's just been this very, very slow process of writing on my own and trying to find alliances that keep me alive creatively and economically, and trying to remain in contact with the great writers, not lowering my standards. In other words, like, I think it was a good idea to move to New York and want to be Robert Musil or James Joyce. Like, you kind of have to, or William Gaddis, or to at least Chekhov. I really believe that you can't start competing with the last person who got a book deal. You can't start trying to write slightly better than that book that got a good LRB review, or even a bad LRB review. Like, you have to try to do like, if you think you have enough talent to justify that ambition, then you have to kind of maintain your ambition in secret. So there's no real one single way for me to tell this story of being a writer in New York. There are many, many like intertwining accidents, and I think in my case, theater, I kind of sensed that theater was going to be a better vehicle because I wanted to write ambitious and non-commercial literary fiction. I needed some kind of hook, and while my plays aren't like wildly commercial, unfortunately either, there's a proof of concept there, which is the audience, and people come and laugh and respond, and in a way that there's some kind of non-intellectual aspect to the theater thing that I do that isn't really true of my fiction, or even my essays. So basically, I needed to develop I needed my theater company and my work with my work as a director and as a playwright to open up enough eyes that people would start to be like, well, what else does he write? And quite literally, I've had agents and managers and things. When people professionally get in contact with me, I think when my fiction, Mike Mangello, who's my agent at Inkwell, he basically signed me after Times Square was in the New York Times, but we met at a party which was thrown by my friend who is an editor at FSG, who did try to acquire The Sleepers, but he couldn't get it across the desk there. And then basically the agent asked, like, do you have fiction? I was like, I do have fiction. I have this book, The Sleepers, that I wrote, and I would like, that already has some interest. So it's like, I had this idea that you should have things in the drawer, and then when you have a little bit of notoriety, someone's going to ask you what's in the drawer. And in my case, that was true. Now, again, it's still, even after, there are like many moments like that, you don't go from zero to total success, or at least I haven't, but that basic methodology has worked okay.
And so how much has your experience with with theatre informed the writing of The Sleepers? Because at least in my mind, I don't interact with theatre that much. There seems to be a lot of it in there. And has that bled over into your novel writing intentionally? Or is it's just floating around in your mind?
I think it's more than readers and reviewers might imagine, because I'm better known as a playwright. It's true that Mariko, one of the protagonists, is an actor, and she has an affair with one of her old directors who's dying of cancer in the novel. But at the time I started the book, over the years, I think I've written more drama than fiction. Like in the last 6 years, I've focused more on drama. It's gone from but in the beginning of my writing life, it was 100% fiction. And I was still reading more fiction. I still, to this day, I've read much, 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 much more fiction. I don't read much contemporary drama. I don't really like much contemporary drama. So, if anything, what I drew more from is was just understanding the dynamics of being an actor in New York. To construct Mariko, she works at a wine bar. She's doing commercial callbacks for toothpaste commercials. The character of Xavier is obviously a pastiche of a certain type of person that I know from the industry. So it was a way of creating a backdrop for the play. But I think the way I write dialogue is sort of just indigenous to me and can take different forms. I don't think the way I write dialogue is actually something that I started doing because, in a weird way, I think I always constructed dialogues in my head that way, and it just happened to be the case that, for obvious reasons, theater was a natural place to pour that instinct for dialogue. But I didn't develop that style of dialogue through writing plays. Writing plays might have sharpened and clarified how I write dialogue, but my play characters also talk a bit differently than the characters in The Sleepers talk. So I think it's an interesting chicken or egg. I think I said in the other interview I did today, I think there's no way to intertwine the mutual influence of theater and fiction. They're sort of, they support each other. I don't think I could do one without the other. And I think it's interesting when some people only know me as the guy who writes the Substack diaries. Not a lot of people, but there was someone who came to see a play last week because I posted it on my Substack, and he's like, I didn't know you wrote these. I enjoyed it a lot. But I've just been reading your writer's diaries, and I just decided to come see this thing you posted, which I thought was cool. But I guess I do have this old-fashioned idea of a life of letters in which you do practice these things, and you don't think of yourself as a professional.
You mentioning that you'd drawn some of your characters from your knowledge of life in New York, for example. How did these characters come to you? Were you starting out with this concept of, I'm not sure, millennial ennui or something grander like that, and from that arose these characters? Or were there concrete people or concrete composites of people you've met or you've heard of who formed their way into Dan?
Yeah, they're definitely composites. Like I think sometimes in theater I'm writing for actors very specifically, and so a lot of their voice and their way of talking. I'm a big believer in writing for people. I think it makes dramatic writing a lot more lively to kind of try to capture an actor's voice. These characters in fiction, so this is maybe a difference between theater, where I'm much more willing to kind of model a character after a single person, and fiction, whereas I think Dan and Mariko, all these characters, there's not a single person they're based on. There's nothing. None of this happened to me or anyone I know, but these are the kinds of stories that animated a lot of discussions from the mid-2010s. And certainly I generally know the aging actor who's ready to just give up and become a wine bar server forever, or marry into wealth or something, rather than keep going to auditions. And I certainly know the kind of internally conflicted leftist intellectual who's not
know a number of those. Yeah,
I only know one or two. So hard to find those.
Is it?
No, that's the no, it's not hard, and it was particularly not hard in 20. I think Dan is definitely a social type that I'm suggesting peaked around the Bernie campaign, and then from that high point lost social currency. I guess I shouldn't be chewing ice during this interview. I'm drinking lemonade. Is this video only, or are we going to be audio? It's video, right?
Yeah, it'll be both. So people can
leave it in.
People can enjoy the experience of just listening to you chew ice into their ears, into their AirPods while they're taking the train to work, an early morning commute, or they can watch you do it.
A little bit of ASMR. I hate ASMR, by the way. I feel guilty for even accidentally engaging in it.
Such are the possibilities offered by the internet.
We can do the first ASMR literary podcast all in one. So yeah, I think
choose ice in your ears 12 hours, 12 hours bass boosted mix. That's going to be what makes this channel take off.
Anything to sell books. Anything to sell.
One thing I was interested in is, so did you start out this book, and was this book written just as an exploration of the relationships and the inner lives of these characters, or were you trying to uncover something about aging millennials or life in the 20-teens? Which of those things came first, or was it something else, or were you trying to do both of those things at once?
I think it's so hard to answer that question, partly because you have to not think in those terms while you're writing. And so it's hard for me to disentangle my... Like, you kind of have to write with the id, and then you're kind of vaguely aware that the superego is like, oh, you have all these higher level sociological claims you want to make. Yeah, I think I was actually writing much more in intuition. I don't know if this answers the question, but I think I was writing much more in intuition than maybe it would appear. I think in the later stages of editing the book and whittling it down and polishing it, I might have put on some polyurethane, some sociological polyurethane that makes it very clearly a social history of a particular time. But some of it was just based on this feeling that I had around 2017 that things were getting really weird and tragic and tense. And then I think later, because it took so long for the book to get published, and I think, and thankfully, because it's gotten a lot better, it became a lot less naive about itself over time. So it became more ironic and distanced from its subject over time. So there may be the two, like the layers you're identifying are this naive, like in the stream of life aspect of the book, and then the third person indirect narration, which is sort of has a knowingness to it that is a little bit more sociological and kind of talking to the audience, or the reader. I'm used to saying audience. Does that track for you? Does that?
Yeah, it does, because I wanted to ask directly, because I'm not sure if it's really possible, unless someone has done so very, very clumsily, to tell the ultimate provenance of a story if it is trying to talk about times and places or just about people. Because if you're writing for the id, I think the id does have a structure, and if you follow that enough, there will be some structure that emerges in the construction of a piece of work. And yeah, you go over it afterwards in the editing phase. I guess you can map that roughly onto the superego. the superego intervening, if you want to really torture this analogy.
Yeah, we can torture it.
Yeah, but because of that hidden structure of the unconscious, it's often very, very hard to tell how much someone has simply been following that and how much someone has very consciously constructed the book and done so with a purpose.
Yeah, I think too much consciousness would make cowards of us writers, us novelists. And I do think I've been reading this biography of Tolstoy by A.N. Wilson, which is really great. And Tolstoy is a perfect example of the prophet and the social worker is always at odds with the novelist in Tolstoy's. But the novelist keeps kind of just is more powerful, is just more intelligent, and is more coherent than the activist in Tolstoy, the theologian in Tolstoy. Same with D.H. Lawrence, same with even Balzac. I mean, novelists inevitably get involved with society and in the like. If anyone in a vaguely realist vein is going to get deeply involved in the stuff of life, which implies then it naturally will naturally convince themselves that they have great ideas about what life is, should be how it should be arranged. But I think and I say this as someone who's constantly theorizing on Substack. I mean, the writer's diary is full of my theories about life, but I do try to. I don't think I think they can be read as that, but they can't be read as. I think my talent is for like dialectics and for irony and for distance, and so the writer's diaries are they're chewing the food, but they're not digesting the food. So yeah, in the Sleepers, the reason that I wrote Dan is it allowed me to not write about the ideas of the 2010s as me. Write like both, like it allowed me to insert the discourse of the 2010s, like literally the Bernie Sanders campaign rhetoric, the early Jacobin optimism, etc., which Dan is thinking about, and he's thinking about Marx and Veblen, and he's thinking about economists, he's thinking about social theorists. But because Dan's doing that, I somehow something more interesting happens than if I had written an essay as someone who's not particularly well versed in economic or social theory. I'm intuitive enough of a reader to that maybe my notes on those things might be insightful, but I'm not going to write a good coherent essay about that. But somehow historicizing 2015 and its use of the history of ideas through Dan allowed me to do something more interesting than if I was prescriptive. And I look back, so I was keeping a blog. I told this to another interviewer, but some of the stuff Dan writes, not all of it, but some of it, in the samples of his blog that I post that I show in the novel were things that from my own notebooks from 2015. Some of them I made up for the novel, but I used some of my own, I think, naively, my own 2015 naive liberalism in the book I'm making fun. That's my own Easter egg to myself. Because as much as I might have been impressed with my own ideas, they just weren't that impressive. And so thankfully, by creating a character who has the same problem, I can sort of purge that.
On Dan. Yeah, Dan. The character of Dan brought up one of my favorite, if not my favorite, observations in the novel, where you describe him as a Marxist insofar as he's a Calvinist, or a Calvinist insofar as he's a Marxist. Very much a through faith alone.
Yeah.
Will he be rewarded in this life? Not even in the next life. He's getting it right now, which was a really lovely observation. That really brought Dan to life for me. With this examination of millennialism, and I suppose this does apply to Zoomers as well. The processes that have alienated the characters in The Sleepers haven't stopped in 2025. Was this motivated in part too by something you were feeling in your own life, observing in other people? This odd continued adolescence, this inability to really relax.
No, I don't know what you're talking about. Oh yeah, completely. Yeah, because I did feel uncomfortably described in parts of this book, because I think it's inescapable. You know, that
that omnipresent irony as a defense against almost this sense of there being a camera lens within, just always being observed, that idea of being recorded at any point, preventing you from ever relaxing.
I think it's horrifying. I mean, I've written about this on my own Substack pretty recently or constantly. It's just I'm definitely obsessed with that idea. I feel it. I think it's uniquely bad, and there has to be. It's bad in well, it's bad for the reasons you said. We can't know ourselves, and maybe it prevents us from developing, because when you have too much information about yourself, when your own social persona is too well documented, it's very hard to leave it behind.
It's also something completely external, because it, I mean, if we're talking about recording, you're only ever capturing the outer actions. It's not necessarily capturing what motivated those actions, or the inner state, or the subjectivity of those actions. Which is also, it's a strangely lopsided way to live, living purely as an outside.
Isn't it? Isn't it? Yeah. And that's where the phone is so demonic, because it follows us to bed. I mean, I have a flip phone, but that gives me some solace, but yeah, the idea that you only really get sleep. Sleep is the only time when you escape it. For now, until Neuralink is sending us ads in our dreams. Yeah, and that's a big theme of the book. That's a big topoi of the book. That sleep is the last. The dreams and the unconscious are really the last, partially wild part of the interior world. The last forested part of the psyche, and the rest has basically been strip mined. Or the novel shows this process of strip mining in progress. And that's why these characters, 10 years on from the time the novel is set, everybody has acquiesced to some of the pressures that Dan is still conscious of, Mariko's still conscious of, etc. There's still some inner resistance to it in the novel, but by the end, it's gone. And it should remind us that it's basic. For most of us, it's gone as well. We don't even know there should be resistance. We don't know how to. Younger people don't have even a concept of difference.
At least in the novel, and probably people around me as well, and myself, the resistance oftentimes comes in the form of anesthesia, which is it's a rearguard action. Anesthesia in the form of just like highly dopaminergic activities like streaming services, gaming, drugs, like mindless sex, rather than an attempt to find someplace wild. Although in saying that, maybe the attempt to find a wild place in the unconscious through psychoanalysis or something like that would be the absolute last thing you should do, if that would expose that last part of you to that same process of destruction that the rest of your soul has been subject to.
I think people do need that kind of analysis. I would distinguish like depth psychology. I think what most therapy culture is not depth psychology. I would like to believe that any of the classics, Jungian, Freudian, Lacanian, any of the main schools, if practiced in a somewhat traditional way, are redemptive rather than exploitative. My next play, incidentally, is about this.
Are you willing to talk about it yet, or are you?
Yeah, I'll tell you about it. It's kind of my most romantic play in the sense that there's actually a love story that isn't desiccated or destroyed, and it's also the first like really Jungian play. Most of my work is like pretty classically Freudian, and my characters are classic Freudian neurotics. But in this play, it's about a young woman and her cousin. She's an influencer, he has a online like thrift store, like a Depop. He's like they're both kind of successful merchants of the self. He's gay and she's straight. They move in together because they've both gone through breakups, or they're both pushing away the people they love. And they both are doing well, so they move into an apartment on the Upper East Side, and it's kind of a classic Audrey Hepburn. Like, there's a sort of mid-century appeal to the place they're living. And she accidentally moves into next door to her Jungian therapist, who she's been ghosting, who lives in the same elegant Upper East Side building. And the cousin invites her over for coffee, not knowing that the neighbor he's invited over is, in fact, the therapist of his roommate, his cousin. And then basically that is all kind of sketched out in the first scene, and then a series of friends and lovers, family members pass through the apartment as these characters deal with their own they're fighting with their alienation and their desire to talk in the language of boundaries, the language of therapy speak, the language of commerce. But for the first time I've written characters who completely well, maybe not the first time, but it's one of the few plays and few works of any kind of imaginative literature I've written that I felt I use romance in the sense of idealism and optimism about these characters' fates. There's a sweetness to this one. And maybe that's more of the optimism of Jung rather than the pragmatic pessimism of Freud. I don't know, I just got on a Jung jag. I have not been in Jungian analysis, but I say this as someone who's never gone to analysis, by the way. I just read it all. And yeah, so that's the most I'll say. It's called Over the Moon, and there's a lot. There are a couple other. I'm excited about it. I think it'll be ready to be staged in around August or September, and I'll workshop it over the summer. So,
well, that is exciting.
Yeah.
Back to what you were saying about therapy speak.
Yeah. Yes.
It's what do you make of this phenomenon? Because I agree with you. I think there is definitely value to be found in certain psychoanalytic techniques. I'm more familiar with Jung and Freud than Lacan. I know very little about Lacan, but there does seem to be something quite sinister about high throughput therapy. I do have a number of friends who spent years more or less having all their bad decisions justified back to them by therapists for a fairly high hourly rate.
Yeah, isn't that crazy?
And I mean that's one thing when you're directly interfacing with therapy, but I think more insidiously it finds its way out into common parlance and common ways of understanding various situations. Almost all of which strike me as, in a long-term sense, fairly maladaptive.
Yeah.
And oftentimes anesthetic. Again, it's not necessarily revealing the cause of problems, but instead offering ways to ruminate on them without really doing anything about them. Your work oftentimes coming back to therapy speak and therapy language, because it did pop up quite a bit in Sleepers.
Yeah, certain plays of mine are really heavy with them. Other things less so. I'm unashamed. I feel no shame about reflecting that back to my readers and to my audience if I feel like it's indigenous to the characters or has become naturalized to the characters. I am insecure sometimes that maybe it's become so naturalized to me that I sometimes edit it out because I realize I'm just writing in that parlance out of my own because I'm in that default setting rather than the character's default setting, and so it can be really hard to separate therapy speak as the way that we all speak from an intentional authorial choice. And it is important to. Yeah, I think it's important to have a theory of how therapy speaks works.
Have you found a knowledge of Freud or Jung or other psychoanalysts has been helpful to you in that? Or is that really an interest that arose after you'd already recognized?
Oh, no, it predates. Yeah, I think psychoanalysis, I mean, if you watch Woody Allen movies from the 70s, that's where you see, like, psychotherapy speak. That's where you see, or even J.D. Salinger. I mean, like, a lot of New York intellectual characters in previous eras talk in a highly Freudian lingo. My own interest in Freud goes back to teenage years, college. I mean, I think psychoanalysis as a literary realm has been interesting to me for a long time. Psychology has been interesting to me for almost as long as I was conscious. And so it is hard, it is hard to disentangle some of these, like my own psychoanalytically inflected way of interpreting reality and people's behaviors from the like lazy linguistic habits that all of us take part in because therapy speak is so universal now in the West, and from artistic choices to render people in therapy speak because that's how they talk. So yeah, I think all of these forces are at play in my work, and my work is often maybe the way to summarize this is my work is a synthesis of accidental and intentional psychology, psychotherapy, dramatized psychotherapy, which maybe some people are now unclicking the pre-order button, but
it's interesting you describing this particular work, or The Sleepers, as more Freudian than Jungian. For listeners who are concerned that it's too on the nose, I didn't pick up on that particular distinction. Like, it's not that foregrounded. Perhaps if you're a scholar of one of those people, you would really notice that distinction, in which case you probably won't be repelled by that either.
Yeah.
You're interested enough to have gone that deep.
By the way, I should wrap up the interview in about 5 minutes or so. Is that okay?
Yeah, no worries.
Yeah. Well, it's unfortunately my day is moving faster than I am. I'm speaking really slowly, but yeah, I think that's a great question. I think I don't want it to be too legible. I say all of this as if it's again, for people who are listening to this without knowing, like, without having read or watched one of my things. I say all this because I'm much more hypersensitive to my own tendencies. That doesn't actually mean that the book, like the novel or any of the plays, come with like citations. Like this comes from Moses and Monotheism, chapter 2. It's obviously not like that at all. I think I have a pretty amateur understanding of almost everything. I'm not a scholar, and I'm not a psychologist or clinical psychologist, so I kind of I try to read very impressionistically and let it sit, and then but also the truth is a lot of psychological insight comes from just, I don't know, like running a theater company or going on dates or having relationships, friendships, and just talk. Like, I'm also surrounded by neurotic people because that's what New York is. So a lot of it is just lay psychology, lay observations, but just a little bit of theory or a sense of, like, if anything, like just reading Freud can often be unhelpful, except for his like method or emphasis on the hydraulic system of the mind, and like Freud has a very causal theory of the mind, and so like to me that's helpful as a writer, as someone writing dialogue, because you can show the billiard effect of speech. You can show characters switching between hydraulic operating systems. And so you don't need a really deep understanding of Freud to say, okay, now I understand this character switching gears. Now, even that loose framework of the tripartite psyche, okay, that's enough to get. That's even the emphasis on childhood, even the emphasis on genitalia, like these things that Freud does, these very top line understandings. Like, just immersing yourself in Freud is a good way of it gives you a way to question your characters and think about, like, are they saying it's a way of making them more interesting. So when the character says, I need to sharpen my pencil, Freud helps you not be naive about what that means. And in the same way, I think Jung, who I was like really resistant to reading and thinking about, does the same thing for the spirit level, or the potential for a spirit level, and for like the larger collective needs of people. And like the psyche's relationship to history, not to evolution. And Freud's like consumed by the ways in which the brain was formed as a survival engine, which I think is fair and true. But Jung is a corrective, saying, well, what if this survival engine, this computer, this hydraulic system was placed in some kind of larger spiritual framework? What kind of tensions arise from this material operating system existing in a archetypal and spiritual one? I think that, to me, again, I was kind of resistant to that because I didn't believe in it, but I think if you open your, like, on a creative basis, like, that's also the nice thing about fiction, is you can open your mind to things that you're almost like too embarrassed or too professional to, you know, you don't have to go become a full astrology girly to read Jung.
Yeah.
But I think as I've gotten older, I've become more willing to believe things that I thought were embarrassing to believe. So.
Yeah, I've a lot of time for dilettantes being on this stuff. So
yeah, good.
It's an admirable pursuit. So thank you very, very much for coming on, for taking a moment out of your day. For listeners, links to Matthew's work, links to The Sleepers will be in the show notes. Recommend the book. I'll definitely be checking out, particularly your earlier sort of small press.
Yeah, I'll send those along. Novels,
the weirder stuff. I look forward to getting into those. Anything you want to say before jumping off?
No, that's it. It's been a pleasure. Thanks, Jack.
Thanks very much.
See you later.